Hi, welcome to Mormon Scripture Explorations again. Continuing study of the Book of Mormon. Today we're going to be looking at 1 Nephi chapter 2. This chapter begins with the rejection of Lehi's preaching in Jerusalem and the plots to have him executed for blasphemy and as a false prophet. Lehi's in trouble. So the Lord comes to him in a dream and tells him to depart into the wilderness, to leave Jerusalem, essentially to save his life from the immediate threat of the people who want to execute him for being a false prophet, and from the larger threat of the Babylonian wars and ultimate destruction of Jerusalem. Now, prophetic dreams, we already mentioned before, they're a very important part of ancient Near Eastern culture. There's a wonderful book called the Erdman's Dictionary of Early Judaism, which is just out. It's a great resource, and it contains an article on dreams and, half a dozen books discussing the importance of dreams and dream revelations and oracular dreams in the ancient Near East. So this is quite typical of the period. The problem is that Lehi is under threat, so he has to flee into the wilderness. Now, wilderness is a technical term. It comes from Hebrew midbar, which means a region where agriculture is not practiced. There are no cities, and it's land inhabited by nomads or uninhabited. This comes from the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon, the standard Hebrew dictionary, and I'll be quoting it when we deal with Hebrew terms throughout my discussions here. Now, this comparison of the English wilderness with the Hebrew midbar is what is called retro-translation. That is, translating a word in English back to its original word in Hebrew. Now, this is possible because we know that the Book of Mormon is translated into King James style English, or what's also known as Jacobean English. It's a particular style of the language. It was the scriptural and spiritual language of the early 19th century. And as such, was the way you did spiritual discourse, or at least formal spiritual discourse. Because the Book of Mormon is translated in that type of language, it allows us to identify biblical allusions to the King James Version, and then that allows us to look from the King James back into the Hebrew. So this possibility allows us to gain a little insight sometimes into the social and linguistic concepts that are expressed in English back to their original Hebrew. So the study of King James Bible terminology is important and allows us to translate back into the culture. So midbar is the technical term for wilderness, but it is also the name for the book of Exodus. Bimidbar in Hebrew means in the wilderness, and that's the Hebrew name for the book of Exodus. So here, because of this wilderness midbar connection, allows us to see in Hebrew a connection which is vague in English but would have been clear in Hebrew, and that is the departure of Lehi is a symbolic exodus, and we'll pick up that theme in just a little bit. So Lehi obeys the Lord. He leaves his wealth, and these should be chapter 2:3 and chapter 2:4 here on these two scripture references. I made a mistake there. Anyway, he leaves his wealth, and presumably this is because of haste. They just pack up as quickly as they can and go. It describes, verse 4 here describes him having a house in Jerusalem, a land of inheritance, that's some type of agricultural land out in the countryside, and then treasure, which indicates that Lehi was a wealthy man. And his wealth here, Nibley has suspected, and others agree, he's probably a merchant making the Egypt connection work there. There's a little article by Chadwick here on the background of Lehi's lands that you can take a look at if you're interested. So Lehi rushes off into the wilderness, abandoning all his wealth, which of course creates a big problem for Laman and Lemuel. Now, another thing to note here is that this verse gives the time of departure, which is the first year of King Zedekiah, meaning that when we come along later in the Book of Mormon, they date their chronology from this event. So year 1 of the Nephite calendar, which I will abbreviate here as Y with whatever number. So Y1 is year 1, Y2, year 2, and so forth, is 597 BC. We've already talked about how we got that date. Now, this is also equated in 1 Nephi 10 and 19 with the 600-year prophecy of the coming of the Messiah, which we'll discuss when that comes up. But to understand Nephite chronology, we've got to make sure we understand the connection between year 1 as year of Nephite year 1 as year 1 of Zedekiah. Now, Lehi's family is also mentioned in chapter 2, verse 5. We'll get a chance to talk about these individuals a little bit more later on, but right now just take a quick look at these as the names, and we find that Sariah, Laman, and Sam are all Hebrew names, Jewish names that have been identified in non-biblical sources. So it's very interesting that these names actually are authentic Jewish names. Lemuel is as well, but it's a biblical name found in the Bible. But Sariah, Laman, and Sam are authentic Jewish names found in non-biblical Hebrew sources. So that's quite striking. So far, it's 100%. Every one of these names that supposedly Joseph Smith, if you're a critic, Joseph Smith is supposedly just making this stuff up. He manages to get 100% on the first 6 names he mentions in the book. Now, they pass on into the wilderness, and Nibley has written a famous book, Lehi in the Desert, which discusses this. It's 60 years old now, but it's still foundational. It needs to be supplemented by a lot of new studies, but he has some interesting stuff in there, so you can go read Lehi in the Desert, kind of give some background on this. They traveled in the wilderness, which means the uninhabited zones or lands only inhabited by Bedouins, and they come near the shore of the Red Sea. Now, it seems in verse 2, or chapter 2:6, that they travel 3 days beyond the Red Sea along the shore. They call it the borders, the shores of the Red Sea, 3 days more once they reach the Red Sea. And then they camp in a valley with a river of water. Now, this information is kind of vague, but it allows us to figure out more or less what the trail was. A lot of scholars think that Wadi Tayyib al-Ism in Arabia is what they're talking about in terms of the river of water. So let's take a look here at these maps so we can get an idea. Here is a map of the land of Israel, and there's Jerusalem. The red square is the blow-up zone over here. You can see Jerusalem there. Now, the blue line marks the edge of agricultural land, and everything beyond that, at least in this area and then down on into the Red Sea, is all desert. The trail that Lehi took is not known for certain, but based on road patterns of ancient Israel, these black lines represent the probable trail that he took. The red line is unlikely because it's very difficult. In the old days, the Dead Sea was much higher. The cliffs were very steep. It's difficult to make the passage along here on foot. And nowadays, they've cut out a road and stuff, and you can do it. But in the old days, it seemed unlikely. So they probably went down here to around the Hebron area, maybe a little north of that. They could have cut down at that point and followed along the Dead Sea, or they could have gone on down past the agricultural zone and then taken a different route here. This road is a bit easier and probably was the one, at least in my opinion, that they took. And then from this point on, they went on down to the Red Sea, which is at modern Eilat Aqaba, major port for Israel. So that's pretty clear based on road patterns that that's the trail they would have taken down to the Red Sea. From that point, we know they traveled 3 days in the wilderness beyond the Red Sea, or beyond when they reached the Red Sea, in the borders or near the shore of the Red Sea. So this white line indicates that, and Wadi Tayyib al-Ism is here. This is where scholars tend to focus on. If you look over here on the Arabian map, this red box shows you the blow-up of this map, and gives you a sense of more or less where they would have traveled. And there is a good, some springs and a water source, a wadi here, that they could have stopped at. So that's the likely journey up to that point in terms of geography. Now, the text mentions that they pitched their tent by a river of water. Now, that in English doesn't make any sense because rivers are always water. And there's allusions to the concept of river of water elsewhere in both the Bible and in the Book of Mormon. But an English person doesn't say a river of water. Rivers mean water. But that's not the case in Hebrew. There's two different terms, one of which, Nahal, is a river valley or a wadi. It's a dry river valley that occasionally has water flowing through it. And Nahar is a term for a flowing river that has water flowing in it. And notice Nephi says that it's continually flowing in verse 9, which would indicate that it's a Nahar. And so, in Hebrew conceptualization, to say a river of water makes sense because there's two different types. Nahal, that water, dry riverbed, Nahar, a flowing riverbed. And, it's a nice Hebrew connection there that doesn't make much sense in English. Now, at this point, Lehi offers sacrifice. In chapter 2, verse 7, he builds an altar of stones and makes sacrifice there. Now, what's interesting is that Deuteronomy 12 prohibits offering sacrifices outside the temple. Now, this book of Deuteronomy was probably the book of the law discovered by King Josiah and was something that was fairly new at this time. But this prohibition was understood by Jews to mean if you were within 3 days of the temple. The Dead Sea Scrolls Temple Scroll talks about this and says you can't offer sacrifice unless you're 3 days away from the temple. Now, that information can be found in the Brown and Seeley articles mentioned below. So notice, they traveled exactly 3 days out of the land of Israel. That is, once they reached the Red Sea, Eilat was part of Israel in the old days, so that could have been considered part of the land of Israel. You travel 3 days beyond that, and then you can offer sacrifice without violating the Deuteronomy 12 prohibition, according to the understanding of some Jewish groups. So it's very interesting that it fits together quite nicely with this conceptualization of how and when you can offer sacrifice away from the temple. Anyway, he makes this offering to give thanks to the Lord. He doesn't have a burnt offering yet. They do talk about burnt offerings later, but there's a distinction of those sacrifices when we come to the burnt offering passage. I'll talk about that a little bit. Now, Lehi comes to the valley of Lemuel, and at that point, crisis occurs. The valley of Lemuel is probably this Wadi Tayyib Ism that we discussed. But whatever valley it was, crisis occurs. Basically, Lehi's family has followed him, but they don't really believe him. Laman and Lemuel say that he's following the vain imaginations of his heart, meaning he's nutty, he's crazy, he's having these hallucinations, whatever it might be. So Lehi's got a problem in that his family doesn't believe him. And notice, nobody believes him initially. Nephi doesn't, Laman, Lemuel, Nephi, Sam, none of them believe. Now the response is Lehi talks to his sons and tries to appeal to them in poetic couplets to reconsider and to follow him more faithfully. And Nibley talks about this a little bit in one of his books of Lehi in the Desert on Bedouin poetry and its social and cultural function. Now, Laman and Lemuel openly murmur against their father. Nephi and Sam don't, but they still don't believe yet. Laman and Lemuel object to three things. Number one, they've abandoned all their wealth. So these are rich kids, spoiled probably. They like their wealth, they like their lavish lifestyle, and they don't want to go off into the wilderness and abandon it all. Plus, they fear they will perish in the wilderness. That is to say, they think they're going to die just because their dad's crazy. But they also object in 2:13 that they do not believe Jerusalem will be destroyed, and we'll talk about that concept in just a second. Notice, however, that Laman and Lemuel, they murmur, they object, they argue with their father, but they never disobey him throughout the entire book. They always obey their father, even though they hate it, they think he's crazy, they argue with him, they disagree. They never openly rebel against their father. Now, they'll openly rebel against Nephi all the time, and they reject Nephi, but only after Lehi dies do they break off from the group. As long as their father's alive, they respect him. And that's a good Jewish and also Bedouin custom, that you simply obey your father. And that's what Laman and Lemuel do, although they don't. They think he's crazy. Now, their objection that the city of Jerusalem will not be destroyed is based on the sacred Jerusalem ideology of the time. This is associated with two covenants that are described in the Bible. The first is the monarchy, the Davidic covenant with Yahweh's chosen dynasty. And the second is the temple. It is the covenant of Yahweh's chosen place. Now, Yahweh here is Hebrew for the Lord. Now, notice both of these terms are house. That is to say, when you talk about the house of David, it is the Davidic dynasty or family. It's called the house of David. The house of the Lord is also the temple. So both of these are house ideologies. That is, the Lord has promised that the house of David will not be destroyed. The Lord has promised that the temple will not be destroyed. And you can see this reflected in Jeremiah 7:4, where they talk about this type of thing. These are eternal, unbreakable covenants. Now, the difference here is essentially that one group said they're unbreakable covenants. The Lord's going to save us no matter what. The other group says, oh no, if you sin, if you don't follow the law, the Lord's covenant is null and void, and both the house of David and the house of the Lord can be destroyed. That was essentially the ideological split, whether these were absolute covenants or whether they reflected partial covenants that could be broken if violated by the people of Israel. Now, the Jews in Jerusalem at the time also reflected back on the salvation of Jerusalem from the Assyrians in the days of Hezekiah and Isaiah, which would have been about 100 years earlier. And this is recounted in biblical texts as well. So they said, look, things were really bad under Hezekiah and Isaiah, but the Lord saved us. Things are really bad now, but the Lord's going to save us just as he did from the Assyrians. Now, of course, they were wrong. In fact, the Davidic monarchy was destroyed, and the last king of David was Zedekiah, last king of the house of David, and also the temple was destroyed. Although the temple was restored, the house of David was not restored until the coming of Christ, when the Davidic monarchy essentially, its final manifestation came with the Messiah. That's another issue we can discuss later. But that's the sacred ideology of Jerusalem. It's the ideas that lay behind Laman and Lemuel's claim that Jerusalem's not going to be destroyed. Now you can read about this in the Seeley and Satterfield articles there that are shown at the bottom of the screen. We also, when we come to the valley of Lemuel, or this valley where they're camping by the river of water, we have some nice articles that discuss these types of ideas, and the best one's probably the Brown article. And if you read that, you need to look at the PDF version, because there's lots of photographs, illustrations, and maps, which give you a good idea about this valley of Lemuel and what the terrain is like, and probable location as Wadi Tayyibilism. Now, we know Laman and Lemuel's reaction is to openly murmur and argue with their father. Nephi's reaction is different. He doesn't know for sure if his father's a true prophet or if he's just crazy. But Nephi's response is to have a great desire to know the mysteries of God. That is to say, to know the things that had been revealed to Lehi. This harks back to chapter 1, verse 1, where Nephi talks about the mysteries of God. So Lehi had the mysteries of God revealed to him in his great vision that we talked about in chapter 1. Nephi wants to know those same mysteries. He wants the same type of knowledge. And so he cries unto the Lord. That is, he prays. The Lord visits him. We don't know if this means a vision or not, But he softened his heart, that is to say, Nephi came to believe that Lehi's words and does not join his brothers in their objections. Nephi is also able to convince Sam, but when Nephi talks to Laman and Lemuel, they do not believe him. And notice the difference between the soft heart of Nephi and the hard heart of Laman and Lemuel. So the reaction is that Nephi gets his own divine confirmation. Initial uncertainty followed by divine confirmation. Laman and Lemuel don't seek that divine confirmation. They simply reject their father. Now, this chapter has a number of passages which talk about the idea of heart. There's foolish imaginations of Lehi's heart, which means hallucinations and craziness. Nephi has a soft heart and has a low heart. Laman and Lemuel's hearts are hard. Now, this term heart can be retro-translated into Hebrew as leb, and it means the organ itself, that is, the physical organ of the heart in our body, but also metaphorically means your essential self, your inclinations, your will, your intentions, your reason, your conscience, all those types of ideas. Now notice in Hebrew, the heart is the center of will and reason, not just the center of emotion. In English, we have separated the mind and reason as something functional in the brain, and emotions and intuition as something coming from the heart. This is a metaphor we use. That's not that conflict or differentiation, dichotomy does not exist in Hebrew thought. Heart and mind are the same thing, basically. So when you talk about imaginations of the heart, soft heart, low heart, hard heart, we could say mind as well. The two concepts are the same. They're not differentiated in Hebrew. They are differentiated in Greek and in English, but not in Hebrew. Now, because of Nephi seeking the Lord in vision, or seeking the Lord's mysteries, God makes a covenant with him. And this covenant is closely associated with the Deuteronomistic covenants of Nephi's days. So let's take a look at that. The first thing, the essence of the covenant is that if you keep the commandments, you will prosper in the land. This passage is the most quoted throughout the whole Book of Mormon. Intertextually, it is repeated over and over again in many different forms. This is essentially a variation on the Deuteronomistic covenant, which is found in Deuteronomy 28 and those other passages mentioned there, especially Joshua 23 to 24 goes into a lot of detail on this. The Deuteronomy covenant is part of what's called Josiah's reforms, which are discussed in 2 Kings 22 and 2 Chronicles 34. The discovery of the book of the law, which most scholars think was part of or some form of the book of Deuteronomy. That book was discovered in the temple in the days of Josiah. Josiah and Lehi are probably rough contemporaries, about the same age. Maybe Lehi's a little younger. Anyway, Josiah finds these and he reforms the whole structure of Israelite religion and temple worship and the law based on this book they discover in the temple. This is discussed in Glimpses of Lehi's Jerusalem in the Christensen and Barker articles, and you can find those online. It goes into lots of detail. But the point is, this Deuteronomistic law is Deuteronomy 28, and it's essentially, keep the commandments, the Lord will bless you. Disobey the commandments, the Lord will curse you. That's the essence of it. So this covenant is reiterated with Nephi. Keep the commandments, prosper. He also is promised that they will be led to a land of promise. Now, this is a different land of promise. It replaces the land of Israel as the land of promise for the Nephites. So notice he has a new covenant, he has a new land, and then Nephi will be made the ruler and teacher, which replaces the Davidic covenant of kingship. Right? Now notice, the land's going to be conquered by the Babylonians, the Davidic kingship is going to be overthrown, the temple is going to be destroyed. All of those things are lost, but all of those covenants are renewed with Nephi, as we'll see in just a moment. So what you've got then is Nephi receiving a new covenant from the Lord, a new promised land to replace Israel, which is destroyed by the Babylonians, the new ruler teacher, Nephi, which replaces essentially or supplements Moses. And then a new temple will be built in the new land as well. So notice that the whole covenant structure of ancient Israel is renewed in a variant form with Nephi. New covenant, new land, new ruler, teacher, family. This would be the Davidic line, the Davidic kingship line, and a new temple which will be rebuilt. So it's very interesting that all of those essential elements of the biblical Israelite covenant are renewed in a new way, in a new place and time with Nephi. On the other hand, with a covenant, there's always a curse. And so there's a rebellion and curse that comes along with this. It specifically talks about Laman and Lemuel, but in reality, it applies to all Lehites who rebel. The first curse is that they are cut off from the presence of the Lord. This translates a Hebrew term, Yahweh, which means the face of the Lord. They are no longer can see the face of the Lord. And this is temple language. They are essentially expelled from the temple, is what it means. They are cursed with a sore curse, and you can read about this curse in Deuteronomy 27:11-26. They have no power over Nephi's seed, which is essentially the Davidic covenant of kingship. Nephi's dynasty will prevail, just as David's dynasty will prevail, as long as they keep the covenants. When they don't, the Lamanites will have power over Nephi's seed. And then the Lamanites will scourge Nephi's seed to stir them up to the ways of remembrance. That is, if Nephi's descendants rebel, break the covenant, the Lamanites will serve as a scourge to stir them up to the ways of remembrance. Now, remembrance is a central theme in the Book of Mormon. We'll discuss it a great deal later, but essentially what's going on here is that you have this conditional promise and covenant. Keep the commandments, prosper in the land. Fail to keep the commandments, you're cut off, you're cursed, and you're scourged by your enemies. You're defeated by your enemies. Now, what we see then is 1 Nephi 2 is essentially a broad pattern is an Exodus motif. Lehi's initial revelation is essentially the parallels Moses's first revelation at Mount Sinai. Lehi's exodus from Jerusalem parallels the exodus from Egypt, and then Nephi's covenant equals the second Sinai covenant with Moses and all of Israel at the base of Mount Sinai. Now, it's in a sense a Lehite covenant because it will apply to all of the descendants of Lehi, can be Laman and Lemuel's descendants as well, as we will see. Sometimes they're part of the covenant, and sometimes Nephi's descendants are rebellious. So it's a broader covenant. I think it's a Lehite covenant, not just a Nephite covenant, but it's made with Nephi and not with Lehi because of Laman and Lemuel's rebellion. And we've got a couple articles there by Brown and Reynolds which go into the details on these Exodus motifs, which are very interesting as well. So that's, I think, the significance of chapter 2. It lays the foundation for the new covenant in the new land, and we'll then move on to chapter 3 next time when we start looking about brass plates information, which is another key element of the ancient covenant, and that is Torah. So thanks for listening to Mormon Scripture Explorations.